On Friday noon, July the 20th, 1714, the bridge of San Luis Rey, the finest bridge in all Peru, broke and precipitated 5 travelers into the gorge below. The bridge was on the high road between Lima and Cusco, and hundreds of persons passed over it every day. It had been woven of osier by the Incas more than a century before, and visitors to the city were always let out to see it. The bridge seemed to be among the things that would last forever. It was unthinkable that it should break. The moment a Peruvian heard of the accident, he signed himself and then made a mental calculation as to how recently he had crossed by it and how soon he had intended on crossing it again. So the story goes that after the funeral services for the 5 souls lost when the bridge failed, the people of Lima collected themselves and moved on with their lives. That is, all but one. Brother Juniper, who had witnessed the bridge snap, was fascinated by what happened. A man of faith in a God whose providence in the world was unquestioned, Brother Juniper saw this tragedy as an opportunity to prove his faith. He reasoned that either there is a plan for everything, or there is no plan and no God at all. And since he believed in God, he knew that there must be some reason why these 5 individuals plummeted to their death. To discover the reason, Brother Juniper set out to collect every piece of information he could about them, desperately hoping to find the pattern that would connect these travelers to God's greater plan for the universe. The story of Brother Juniper's quest and his findings comprise Thornton Wilder's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey. The novel touches on some of the most primal and difficult questions we have about why accidents happen, why the innocent suffer, and whether God really has anything to do with quote-unquote acts of God. Now, I doubt any of us could really share the theological assumptions of Brother Juniper, but I do think that we all feel that chaos and randomness are deeply troubling to our faith. I would bet that even those who do not believe in a personal God who acts in the world would still ask the question, why me? When faced with homes destroyed by earthquakes or bodies ravaged by disease. The paradox of holding on to belief while experiencing the reality of suffering is perhaps the oldest enduring dilemma. Even the most learned of individuals can falter in his faith when confronted by paradox. Consider theologian Bart Ehrman, who grew up a devout, born-again Christian. In his 40s, after half a career as a church-going academic who studied and taught in divinity school and seminary, Ehrman came to the sudden realization that he could no longer believe in God. The problem was that he could no longer ignore the paradox of faith in a God who permits suffering. He writes, I simply could no longer hold the view that God is active in the world, that God answered prayer, that God intervened on behalf of the faithful. We live in a world where a child dies every 5 seconds to starvation. Every 5 seconds. Where is God in this? Now, lest we think that Ehrman just had the wrong theodicy, the book in which he declares his agnosticism is also the book in which he picks apart every conceivable way of justifying suffering. The upshot is that no theodicy exists that can fully withstand every paradox it encounters. So how do we deal with these questions? How do we construct a theology that neither boxes us into a dogmatic faith like Brother Juniper, or lose our faith when confronted by paradox like Bart Ehrman? This question is incredibly important because we all encounter cognitive dissonance in our lives. We will all encounter congregants, friends, clients, family, students, professors who are broken by misfortune or illness. We will suffer it ourselves. Our faith will be tested, and as rabbis and leaders, we must not only be there pastorally for others, but we can't lose ourselves in the process. We have to find a framework for how we deal with paradox. Bill Lifgrief teaches that when we are confronted with cognitive dissonance, the most enlightened way of understanding it is through Januszian thinking. That word Januszian comes from the Roman god Janus, who had two faces pointed in the opposite direction. A Janusian mindset, then, allows us to encounter two conflicting facts, hold them both in our minds, and accept the truth of both of them. Instead of living in a world of either or, Janusian thinking is the mindset of both and. It is the kind of thinking that allows us to embrace keva and kavanah, to say Israel can be Jewish and democratic, to accept science and religion, to be Jewish and modern, in not forcing us to pick one truth and reject the other or to mash them into a dubious synthesis. Janusian thinking is one of the most powerful tools we can use as Jews. It allows us to accept reality without losing ourselves. As I think about the way that our tradition makes use of Janusian thinking, I'm struck by two sugiyot in the Bavli. The first of these comes from Brachot, and it starts with the assertion that God protects the righteous from suffering. Now, of course, the rabbis had to acknowledge that sometimes those who suffer don't deserve it. So, to deal with that cognitive dissonance, the rabbis constructed a concept called Yisurim Shel Ahava. That is, the belief that suffering is sometimes not a punishment, but rather a manifestation of God's love. One could read this concept into the prophet Amos, who declared that Israel's chosen status meant that God would hold the Jewish people to a higher standard of morality. Now, as problematic and potentially abusive as this theology is, I also believe that it is a brilliant piece of Janusian thinking. When the rabbis were debating the ideas in the Talmud, the Roman Empire had gone through the process of converting to Christianity. In Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish communities were persecuted to the point of degradation, and some Christian theologians asserted that the misfortune was God punishing them for not accepting Christ. In asserting that suffering is not always a punishment, the rabbis in Brachot engage in a protest theology of yes and. Yes, Jews suffered from persecution. And yes, they still have a beloved relationship with God. But the text doesn't stop there. In a further manifestation of Janusian thinking, the rabbis then challenge the concept of Yisurim Shel Ahava when they themselves experience illness or personal loss. After burying his 10th son, Rabbi Yochanan rejects Atana's attempt to comfort him with this theology. He answers that this tragedy could not possibly be an example of Yisurim Shel Ahava. I believe that in not forcing himself to accept a theology that he cannot believe in, Rabbi Yochanan holds on to his integrity by allowing himself to exist in a paradoxical space without having to make sense of it. The second text that engages us in Janusian thinking comes from Menachot. As Moses waits for God to give him the Torah, he grows impatient because God is taking so long affixing the little crowns to the letters in the scroll. Moses asks what's taking so long, and God tells him of a man in the distant future who will make meaning out of the little crowns. Moses asks to see this miraculous man, and God transports him to the back of Rabbi Akiva's academy, where he hears the most wondrous and incomprehensible Torah. Moses is astounded by such a learned man and asks God what reward could be befitting of such a scholar. God then shows him the Romans weighing out Akiva's flesh after they have executed him. When Moses cries to God about the horrific injustice of this fate, God tells him to be silent, for that is what has been decided. This story is absolutely brutal. It dashes out any expectation that one could have of the righteous receiving a material reward on earth. It does not even give us the comfort of knowing whether Akiva entered heaven. And then it tells Moses to shut up and accept it in silence? How can we make sense of that? I believe that the rabbis speaking for God are not as much silencing Moses' protests, so much as they are teaching us an important lesson in Janusian thinking, because they had to grapple with a two-faced history. Yes, they believed that God lovingly made them the Torah. And yes, many of God's chosen people, indeed some of the most pious and righteous, suffered and died for their Jewish identity. It doesn't make sense. But that is the paradoxical history that they had to grapple with. And for us who have seen modernity bring both unprecedented levels of societal advancement At the same time, as it has created inconceivable human suffering and alienation, this is a lesson that we too have to grapple with. And just maybe, God's command to be silent does not force us to accept the world as it is, so much as it allows us to achieve freedom from despair. In considering this, I think about the words that my high school English teacher, Patricia, shared with me recently. She writes, "On a practical, everyday level, I permit my mind to hold incongruent viewpoints. I can deeply despair some piece of news, but also feel the opposite emotion and declare another reality, that I have gratitude and hope and feel empowered. Sitting in a paradox space without seeking to put perfect little words around it helps me see my freedom. I see I can take action in the midst of paradox. I can choose to blame the doctor for not having discovered the problem earlier. I can choose to hate God who let me be sick in the first place. I can choose to love God. I can fall into despair and feel powerless to cope. Or I can say simply that this is real, this is authentic, that this is beyond all the words running inside my head." Patricia was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer in 2005. She has lived with physical pain that at times, in the words of Elaine Scarry, has unmade her universe. She has lived with the knowledge that if the next experimental treatment does not work, she might only live a few more months. She has also felt empowerment and spiritual freedom. I believe that she derives her strength and courage precisely from her ability to live in paradox, at once fully acknowledging the reality of her suffering and also finding resilience in her faith. That is precisely the kind of belief that can survive earthquakes, floods, disease, or indeed a collapsed bridge. Maybe you're wondering if Brother Juniper was successful. Did he ever figure out God's reason for why those travelers died on the bridge that day? The answer is no. They didn't deserve to die. Moreover, when Brother Juniper published the book of his findings, the church declared it heresy and burned it. But perhaps, in the ultimate Genusian ending, the book doesn't end with Brother Juniper's failed theology. Thornton Wilder closes the book with another character, the abbess, the only person who knew all 5 of those travelers. In contrast to Brother Juniper, whose response was driven by dogma, the abbess responds to this tragedy by reaching out and embracing the family members of the dead who come to her searching for comfort and answers in their mourning. In the final pages, she says to one of them, "I scarcely dare say it, but in love, the ugliness of it all doesn't seem to last very long." And maybe that's part of the answer. In the face of randomness and chaos and suffering, we should feel angry at God, and justifiably so. But after we work through that anger, I believe that the only thing left to do is to love even harder. Love those who come to you with their pain and despair. Love the world when it seems to be falling apart. Love yourself and your brokenness, and most of all, love God, especially when you're mad as hell at God. As much as we try to control the world, the fact is that bridges collapse randomly and indiscriminately. But when we hold on to Genusian thoughts and can move beyond a place of dogmatism or disbelief, we can find the empowerment to act, to fix, to heal, to rebuild, to love. And in so doing, I believe that we bring God into our broken world.